June 17th, 1994 is widely remembered as a day that the sports world crashed together. You remember, obviously, it was the 1994 US Open. Arnold Palmer was competing for the last time. It was game 5 of the NBA Finals. And then all of a sudden, breaking news coverage of the Bronco chase interrupts the game. How big does something have to be to take away the attention from such a big game?
It has to be very, very big. I mean, this was crazy because the NBA finals are always such a draw for the eyeballs anyway. So they have this constant little corner shot on the broadcast of the white Bronco. So, you're watching the game, but you're getting updates from Tom Brokaw. You're getting, call-ins from people like Al Michaels. You're getting all this news while watching a basketball game. And I think the basketball game at that point became secondary. Everyone was just keeping an eye on this white Bronco. I remember being on an airplane on the way to Los Angeles that very night, and the pilot was keeping us up to date on what was going on with this white Bronco. So it was I can't remember ever being as shocked in the world of sports as I was that night.
That anecdote that you just said about the pilot keeping you updated. I mean, I have to admit, you and I, obviously, we've lived half of our lives on planes. The only time the pilot has ever updated us on something was when I flew. It was during a Super Bowl. And he updated us with the Super Bowl score and the thought that this Bronco chase was indeed immediately of such paramount import for the pilot to tell a commercial airline flight. I mean, that just blows my mind. And it's also important to note that, remember, in the 80s, OJ and Arnold Palmer had their Hertz commercials together. So the irony as well.
Yes, the irony of airports and running and high-speed chases, or low-speed in this case. You're right. It was all just so crazy. And I can remember everyone on the plane just looking at each other going, this cannot be happening. This can't be real. Can this be real? But I remember as we were approaching LAX, the international airport in Los Angeles, the pilot saying, okay, folks, so here's what we're seeing and here's what we're dealing with. And when we land, da, 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 da. And as soon as I touched down, I drove to my parents' house and I said, Dad, should we go to the freeway and watch this thing? But we didn't. We stayed at home and we watched. But it was crazy because I remembered the people lining the freeways who either were forced to pull over or who went to some of these pedestrian overpasses along this interstate were shouting at him and waving at him as though they were cheering him on. And it was really crazy when you think of the mindset it takes to do that, when you really don't know if this man is innocent or guilty. Everyone wanted to believe OJ was innocent, but running, that's kind of a sign of guilt.
And it's especially sort of disconcerting now in hindsight to think about the parade quality and the crowd effect happening at the time when, remember, he wasn't driving. He was sitting in the back seat holding a gun to his own head. And therefore, that sense of cheering him on, but that's the scenario going on inside the vehicle was had the potential for an absolutely horrific turnout, even more than the scene that had been uncovered by police, and the family just a few days earlier. What was going on in the sports world? Describe the earthquake that subsequently happened just in the sports world, let alone the convergence of the trifecta that day. But what happened once you landed? Like, what happened within the sports world?
I think everyone was just in a sense of disbelief. O.J. Simpson was one of the most charismatic, most transcendent athletes of our time, period. A Heisman Trophy winner, USC running back, #1 overall pick in the NFL draft, successful, a Hall of Fame career in both college and football. And the charisma factor, the fact that he did work on NFL broadcasts. He was in the movies, Towering Inferno, all the Naked Gun films, the Hertz commercials. All of this made OJ more than just a football player. He was a celebrity and he was extraordinary. And part of it was because at the time, he would say things like, I'm not black, I'm OJ. So he transcended this issue of race as well. But I do remember days prior when we first saw him handcuffed on his front lawn, And that was a shock to the system. I can picture it now as I'm sitting here talking to you as like it was yesterday. We all were looking at each other saying, those of us who cover sports were saying, okay, hold on. Why is he in cuffs? What are they doing to him? Why would they do this? This can't possibly be OJ who has murdered these two people. It just can't possibly be. And then as the details began to come out and we heard the stories, it became surreal and it became more and more likely that this man was involved. And this person that we all adored had a monster living inside of him.
So it sort of sounds like, and if not described further, almost that there was a hesitation initially to accept that such a beloved athlete, a transcendent celebrity, could possibly be responsible for such a heinous crime. And then on the other side, the evidence or the facts as they were coming to light. So this incredible fall from grace within the sports industry, was there a prolonged reluctance to accept that? Did it seem like there were more people, quote, on his side? Or how did that sort of evolution play out?
From the time that we first saw him in handcuffs on his front lawn to the time that he then was arraigned in court, and then we knew he was going to spend a night in jail. And these odd details come to mind. It's crazy, Emily. The details like he wanted his own pillow in the jail cell that first night, because he couldn't sleep. Things like that. It just made him seem like, oh, no one who's guilty is going to ask for their own pillow. Clearly, we got to make OJ feel comfortable, right? So it took some time. And I ended up staying in Los Angeles. I had flown out there for Father's Day. And then I decided to stay. I was working for a radio station. And I said, I'll cover the arraignment. And I drove to LA, downtown LA for this first arraignment, watched his van pull in. I am telling you, this courthouse was surrounded by people. And the vast majority of them were people who did not want to believe that O.J. Simpson could do this. It could be a murderer. And so they were cheering. And when he arrived, they were cheering. And when his lawyers arrived, they were cheering. And people were holding signs, free OJ. And even by then, and this is in a relatively short period of time, people were selling merchandise outside the courtroom, T-shirts and mugs, free OJ. So it took a while, but the more that the evidence, just dropped piece by piece, the more it became pretty clear.
If you recall, because this is sort of a detailed question, but in those crowds that were cheering him on, especially initially, did it seem like it represented a kaleidoscope and a cross-section of America? Did it seem to represent a certain demographic, or, was it the 25-year-old football fan, or was it the longtime LA resident? Was there anything specific, or was it diverse in all ways?
It was a kaleidoscope of people. Yeah. I can remember, but I would say most people were probably over the age of 25. A lot of people right from there in LA who maybe just drove a couple blocks or even walked to the courthouse, men and women, old and young. I would say there was a good number of the African-American community that felt like OJ was theirs. And they wanted so badly for OJ to be found innocent, which he ended up being acquitted. So in that first gathering, though, I'll tell you, initially it was everybody. No one could believe it that this was possible. But the crowds that started gathering that first and second day around the courthouse, I would say there were a lot of Los Angeles who again felt like OJ was kind of their son or their brother. But one of them, and they wanted to be there to defend him. So it was fascinating. There's another really interesting little tidbit that O.J. Simpson, just prior to all of this, had recorded a pilot of a show for NBC. And the pilot was called, I'm going to start this answer. A quick anecdote, Emily. I don't know if you know this, but just before all of this happened, Warner Brothers shot a pilot of a show called Frogmen. And NBC was considering picking this up. And it was about former Navy SEALs that were kind of banded together to take care of crime. And OJ was the star. Now, this pilot was 2 hours long, and they could have released it as a television event. But they canceled it because, guess what? OJ got arrested. And literally, the timing on this was incredible. And there were reports that OJ had learned some military training to prepare for this role, and that there was actually a scene in this pilot of him holding a knife to a woman's throat. So as much as NBC and everyone else knew we could make a fortune if we put this on the air right now, they didn't. They held it back. They didn't want it leaked to the press. They didn't want anyone seeing any of this. But it is an extraordinary story, and one that sort of makes you scratch your head.
Wow. Was the identity of that, was the that having happened, was that widely known or released at the time, or this is something that years later NBC kept it closely held to their chest for many years?
Everyone kept it pretty quiet.
Wow.
In fact, one of the executives at NBC made sure he collected every copy of the pilot that he thought existed. But when the story goes, when investigators went in to search OJ's home, they found a copy of the pilot. They found scripts. They found dailies, those short reels of what had been shot each day that OJ had kept at home. But this was suppressed. It was not brought into evidence at all. I can see why a judge would not want that brought into evidence. He was shooting a film, but it really has some eerie undertones to it.
And a different era. Nowadays, I think you can't keep anything a secret, certainly not in the media world.
True.
But before OJ, before this, and this, the magnitude, again, I think as you aptly do, we can't ever overstate how colossal this fall from grace was and the shock. Were there any other big athlete scandals, though, that shook the sports industry that preceded this?
I mean, I'm sure that there were, but I can't think of one this gigantic. Because we're talking about a double homicide here. And we're talking about a fall from grace that is, I can't think of anything that parallels it. We're talking about a story that has so much drama to it that supposedly that night there was a school play or some sort of school event that Nicole went to with her family, didn't sit with OJ, and later had dinner, and later went home, and Ron Goldman was supposedly delivering a pair of glasses to her home when OJ approached. And then there were people who thought for sure they had seen OJ fleeing the scene, but they sold their story. And so that was thrown out. Once you sell that story, it can't be produced as evidence in a court. So many things. And then he goes and gets on a plane. Right. And he flies and he suddenly has this cut on his hand. And he says, well, I broke a glass in my hotel room when I learned that my wife had been murdered. All of these things, these stories about him putting a suitcase, some sort of suitcase or carry-on bag into a trash bin. No one knows what was in that. And it was never found. He did that at LAX reportedly. So all of these sordid, mysterious details just kept coming out and coming out. And the more it slapped you in the face, the more you realized this doesn't look good. And there's a part of OJ we didn't know about. Some people did. Obviously, people close to Nicole did. Obviously, the LAPD did because they had been called to their home many times. But it was kept very quiet. And it was so hard to imagine that O.J. Simpson could be capable of something so earth-shattering.
So to that point, okay, so it was kept close. So did anyone in the sports world know about, because specifically, Nicole, we know this, she made many calls to the police, right? Informing them about OJ's violent behavior toward her. There was a long history of these recorded interactions and the like, her friends, her family. But am I hearing correctly that the sports world really, truly never had any idea of that? Or was there some inklings of his reputation being stained prior to the murders?
Well, let's put it this way. If there were people within the sportscasting community, within the football, the NFL community, within that sort of celebrity community in which OJ circulated, if they knew anything, they did a darn good job of keeping it quiet because it was not common knowledge. It was not even hinted about to most of us. These things began to sort of become rumors after her murder. Well, I saw him really angry once, or he does have a temper, or, but But these things, of course, were people looking back in hindsight and saying, I have seen O.J. Simpson lose his temper in this scenario or that. Can I see this happening? Is it this kind of a rage that I saw? So, I think that if he had any kind of outbursts in the past, people sort of accepted them as being from a former NFL star who, for whatever reason, could have an outburst now and then.
Final question. How did this case, if it did, sort of pull the curtain back and expose a violent side of the sports industry?
I think that we talk a lot these days about CTE, this brain injury that NFL players have known to have had. Junior Seau was diagnosed with it. He had had some outbursts in his life, and he had been a great Hall of Fame player. And we hear about a lot of other players complaining of the effects of so many concussions or so many hits. We don't know that this is what caused O.J. Simpson's outburst. And to my knowledge, no one ever brought a forceful case forward that was, in fact, responsible for any of his outbursts. It would be interesting to know that. So I wouldn't say that this blew open the doors on CTE or anything else NFL related. Certainly, I think it made us understand that these players, no matter how well they presented themselves publicly, they weren't beyond scrutiny, that they were just as capable, not all of them, obviously, this was a rare instance, but murderers can come from all kinds of walks of life. And so I think after this, when you did hear about spousal abuse, or you did hear about child abuse on the part of a pro athlete, it was scrutinized much more carefully. And I think that people thought there's no way we can let this slide ever again, because the results could be disastrous. So I think that certainly the scrutiny grew and it became more magnified after this entire event. And it's just all so sad. And as all of us watched it like it was a soap opera or a drama, this was something that happened to two young people with so much life ahead of them, with family, with children, with parents and siblings who adored them. And I think that oftentimes we forget that these big time celebrities, they are humans, they have lives, they have family that you don't often hear about that could be, feeling the effects of something that they might be doing. And it's easy to forget that when the spotlight is on these men and women in such a fashion that they are.
Perfectly said. As always, Michelle Tafoya, the best on the field and off. We are so grateful for your insight, as always, and your perspective. Thank you so much.
Great to talk to you, Emily.